Welcome to our presentation about the review article Machine Learning, Algorithms, Real-World Applications and Research Directions by Iqbal H. Sarker from March 2021. Before we dive into it, I will quickly walk you through what this presentation will cover. We tried to summarize the paper to make it easily understandable and interesting. Therefore, we had to leave out some information we deemed as not as important, but I think you will still learn a fair bit. First, I will summarize the purpose of the paper. Then we will get a step-by-step introduction into machine learning, what it is, how data is related to it, different types of data, different types of algorithms and their specific uses, real-world applications, and future research directions as suggested in the paper. I will conclude this presentation with giving you my own opinion on the paper, and I'm already looking forward to our discussion. Let's go! Since we are living in the age of endless data, Internet of Things, etc., dealing with it is a huge challenge. Machine learning is key to using, understanding, and learning from the data. This paper therefore aims to summarize most common ML algorithms and their respective applications, trying to give noobs an overview. But what is machine learning anyways? Well, to some people's horror, it is mostly math and smart algorithms. Do not fear though, most algorithms are quite intuitive to understand, and sometimes you don't even need to, as there are plenty of frameworks doing the work for you. What about deep learning? Also just math. You probably all already heard from ANNs, artificial neural networks that are inspired by actual neural networks, using a smart technique called backpropagation in order to learn. We're not going to dive deeply into this though. An important note about machine learning: it gives the opportunity to deal with large amounts of data with which we are confronted in this age. There is not yet any real intelligence, though. Let's break it all down. What kind of data do we have to deal with, and what kind of machine learning techniques can, or rather, should we use for which task? We save ridiculous amounts of data every day. Traffic data, health data, phone data, we have everything. Finding and analyzing patterns in this big data is a huge challenge and calls for smart algorithms, which luckily we have. Unfortunately, not all data can simply be thrown into our ML frameworks and analyzed. Usually, the types of data can be divided into 4 subcategories. Structured and well-defined data, which can be easily used. Semi-structured, which is already somehow well organized and only needs little pre-processing. Unstructured data, chaos. And metadata, which is data about the data. Real-world data, unfortunately, is often chaos, unstructured or semi-structured, meaning we have to pre-process and clean it before we can work with it, which in itself is one of the main tasks a data scientist has to face, and which is an important future task. The most common machine learning tasks can be classified into these subcategories: classification, clustering, dimensionality reduction, where classification is an example for supervised learning and clustering one for unsupervised learning. See the meme. This is a great classification challenge, the pinnacle of computer vision and machine learning united. Other important tasks are regression, where we do not intend to predict a class or category, but rather a floating point number. Also a huge challenge is dimensionality reduction. If you have ever heard of the phrase curse of dimensionality, you might already have a hunch about why this is a difficult task. Dimensionality is great. High-dimensional data can include a lot of information, but it comes at quite a high cost. Therefore, filtering out only those features that are important, i.e. not linearly dependent, reduces the needed computational resources by a lot. Please remember that this meme is only for attention and not about actually representing information. Now, let's specify what we heard a little bit. Supervised learning, i.e. classification. In order to classify different images into either dog or muffin, we need an algorithm that maps the input image to the output muffin or dog. In order to find a function doing exactly this, we first need training samples from which we learn how each of the classes looks. Ergo, we need labeled training data. Unsupervised learning could be a clustering task. Here we do not know anything about the data. We don't have any labels, but rather want to find out about patterns in the data. Therefore, we need an algorithm that looks at the data and clusters it accordingly to a similarity measure specified by the user, us. Semi-supervised learning, a mixture. Since obviously it is a tedious work to label every tiny bit of data, a lot of it is unlabeled. And sometimes we have to mix both in order to get better results and more training data. Reinforcement learning, an interesting approach to learning, where an actor tries to find optimal behavior given feedback from its action and the environment. This is often used in robotics. Now, let's dive a little bit deeper into the actual algorithms the paper presents. They are briefly introducing these lot, but since our time is limited, we are going to focus on the ones printed in bold letters, namely the k-nearest neighbors algorithm, support vector machines, decision trees, and random forests. K-nearest neighbors. This is a rather simple algorithm, which can be used for classification as well as regression. It makes predictions based on the label or value of the k-nearest neighbors, where k is the only hyperparameter we have to specify. It is quite robust to noise and fast. Given an unknown data point, we compare it to the data we know, looking for the k known data points that are most similar to our query, and then assign the class or value that most of the similar data points have. Next up are support vector machines. You should have already heard of them in the lecture. The basic idea is that a support vector machine constructs a hyperplane which is n-1 dimensional, separating the n-dimensional data. This hyperplane has the greatest distance from the nearest data points in any class, as visualized in the picture. The actual support vectors go right through those nearest neighbors data points. It can be extended to be circular and multidimensional, of course. In case the data is not separable in n-1 dimensions, we make use of something called the kernel trick, where we map the dataset into a higher dimensional space to make it separable. However, keep in mind that the support vector machine is not so robust to noisy data or overlapping classes. The decision tree and random forest are incredibly powerful machine learning algorithms for supervised learning. They can be used for classification as well as regression, and they are fairly simple to build, understand, and analyze, which is why they are my personal favorite. Basically, each node in the tree represents a feature in the data, and when we want to classify an unseen data point, we walk down the tree, from its root to its leaves, checking each node for if-then decisions. The tree is constructed in such a way that the most important feature, i.e. the one with the highest variance in the dataset, is highest up in the tree. This makes feature analysis easily accessible. A random forest now is simply an ensemble of decision trees. We build loads and loads of smaller decision trees on different random subsamples of the data and classify new data points then based on what the majority of the decision trees would predict. This reduces overfitting and helps generalizing. Now let's dive a little bit deeper into regression tasks. What is regression? Well, before we only tried to predict classes or labels, where there's usually a limited number of which to choose from. Now in regression, we try to predict a continuous result variable based on our data. Still, many algorithms you just saw can be adapted to a regression problem as well, like KNN or decision trees. Additionally, we're going to look at linear and polynomial regression though. Linear, multiple linear, and polynomial regression. Well, the idea of these is fairly simple to grasp as well. While a simple linear regression model tries to find the relationship between the dependent variable y, aka the value we want to predict, based upon one independent variable x, some predictor value, multiple linear regression and polynomial regression do exactly the same, but with more predictor values and non-linearly, respectively. Third main task of machine learning is clustering. This is an unsupervised learning method, meaning we do not have labeled data. Here we also have a few different algorithms which the paper introduces, and we are going to look into k-means, hierarchical methods, which you should already be familiar with from the lecture, and look briefly into Gaussian mixture models. The k-means clustering method is one you probably have already seen in the lecture. It is a rather simple but quite effective and robust algorithm. One only needs to specify k, the number of clusters. The algorithm works in such a way that it randomly chooses k different centroids, either from the data or some random vectors, which is usually a bit better, and then iteratively assigns every data point to the closest centroid. Then the centroids are updated to be the mean of the members of its cluster, and we begin again to assign each data point to its closest centroid. We do that until the centroids do not change much more than a certain threshold within one iteration. Hierarchical clustering is a nice tool if you want to not just cluster but also gain taxonomy information. Hierarchical clustering methods yield a tree, a dendrogram, showing the relations or distances in some way between the clusters. There are two different approaches to this clustering method, the agglomerative and the divisive one. Agglomerative clustering is a bottom-up approach, meaning we start with assigning an individual cluster to each data point. We then iteratively join the closest clusters based on the distance measure we chose to use. The divisive approach goes the opposite way and starts out with all data points in one huge cluster. It then separates the cluster and every resulting cluster based on our specified distance measure. The result is also a dendrogram, as you can see above. We can choose the number of clusters based on this, since it gives us a lot of information. Be aware though that the form of clusters may vary based on the distance measure chosen. The Gaussian mixture model is in some ways similar to k-means. However, it does not assign cluster belonging to a data point, but rather probabilities of its belonging to the respective cluster. The values of each feature of the data are usually somehow distributed, and we can represent this with a Gaussian. This also works in higher dimensions, of course. It's just much harder to grasp. Now to the part that is similar to k-means. We use the expectation maximization algorithm and follow these steps. First, we randomly choose the parameters of our Gaussians. Then iterate. We assign the probability of belonging to each point and then recalculate the parameters. This algorithm is a bit more complex but also more robust than k-means. Dimensionality reduction. Why do we need it? Earlier, I have already hinted at the curse of dimensionality. What is that? Well, as you know, every data point can be represented as a vector, as large as the number of features we have available. The problem is that often not all features are represented in every data point, or that features are correlated. In the former case, we call the dataset sparse. Now, the more features we have, the higher is also the computational effort we have to do calculations. Therefore, we want to find a nice balance between the smallest number of dimensions still representing the information needed and the biggest number of dimensions still feasible to do calculations with. A sparse dataset can be mapped into a smaller dimension via dimensionality reduction. A dataset where features correlate can be as well. Here we would not even lose much information. There are, of course, different ways to reduce dimensionality, and therefore computational efforts. One is feature selection, where we would select a subset of the original features representing the data best. And the other would be feature extraction, where we would basically create new features based on the original ones to represent the data. A method to do so is the PCA, which is very well known and often used. The first algorithm for dimensionality reduction I want to introduce is simple thresholding. This is a mean for feature selection. Remember, choosing a subset of original features. We choose based on variance of the feature. But what is variance? The variance shows the average squared distance from the mean of a distribution, i.e. how much the values in one category vary from each other. For now, you can imagine the variance as an indicator about how much information that certain feature holds. The algorithm is rather simple. We only want to use those features that hold a lot of information. Therefore, we calculate the variance for each feature and then only use those with the variance above a certain chosen threshold. Careful though, because you need to normalize the values before you calculate the variance. Next up in the paper is the PCA, Principal Component Analysis. It is one of the most well-known means for dimensionality reduction, but also analyzing feature importance. It works on the whole of the data instead of single features, and calculates vectors, principal components, representing that distribution with the highest variance. If features in the data are correlated, they will be dropped or merged together. If all features are uncorrelated, the PCA will merely give vectors ordered according to their variance. The last big field of machine learning is reinforcement learning. This is a type of machine learning where we have the following variables to deal with: an agent, an environment, rewards, and a policy. The basic idea is that an agent learns through feedback and reward from the environment it gets through performing actions that are chosen by a policy. We then want to find that policy that maximizes the reward. There are, of course, different techniques to do so, like model-free techniques versus model-based ones. Coming to our last fascinating subcategory, deep learning. Here the paper again introduces a number of common machine learning algorithms, but we will focus on what an artificial neural network is, look at the multi-layer perceptron as an example. First off, ANNs are a computational architecture inspired by actual neural networks, though in practice quite different. They consist of several processing layers, hidden input and output layers, which map the input, our data, onto an output, class, value, or whatever we desire. They perform very well on large datasets. Then we will also introduce convolutional neural networks, since they are of great importance all around. Though the paper only just mentions it, I highly recommend looking into generative adversarial networks and long short-term recurrent neural networks, since they are a very smart and promising invention, though a bit more complex. Anyhow, the multi-layer perceptron is the simplest version of the artificial neural network. Before we look at the whole network, let's quickly recap what one single perceptron does. One single perceptron receives an input, which may be a number, and yields an output based on a function we specified and a threshold. Therefore, it can make binary decisions, predict continuous numbers, or do basically everything else depending on the function it is equipped with. A single perceptron is not capable of dealing with nonlinearity though. Therefore, we need more depth. Here multiple perceptrons, layers, and weights come into the picture. The typical MLP is built in the following way. It has an input layer in the shape of a data point. This is followed by a number of hidden layers of varying sizes, which are tightly connected via weights, and an output layer, which is the size of our output. The output of each perceptron plus their respective weight is given to each perceptron of the following layer, added up and put through their respective thresholding function. Sorry about that. The output is then compared to the actual value of the data given, and given this error, usually the mean squared error, the weights within the network are changed respectively. We will not go into more depth about the backpropagation algorithm, since that in itself could easily fill a whole lecture. Another important neural network architecture to know and understand is the convolutional neural network, which is commonly used for image processing. Besides the densely connected classical layers we saw earlier, it also includes convolution and pooling layers. Convolutional layers are basically filters of a specified size sliding over the image, performing element-wise calculations for each pixel within this filter, which results in one single output pixel. This is done for every pixel in the input image. There are of course several hyperparameters to tune, such as stride size or padding, but this is the basic idea. Convolution transforms the image in some way. Pooling layers are there to reduce the size of the image, and therefore parameters needed in the neural networks. It also is a filter operation, whereas this filter does not do calculations, but depending on whether you choose max or average pooling, simply chooses the respective value within that filter window and replaces the others with it. Now, that is all very nice to know about, but where's that stuff actually used? In a huge variety of places. The paper lists only a few of them. But before we dive into them, I want to further stress what I deem the most fascinating topic. It's bioinformatics. Why that, you may ask? Mainly because of the seemingly infinite complexity of biological processes and the immensely large amounts of problems we could solve if we just understood everything a little better. A great and very current example is AlphaFold. AlphaFold, a neural network architecture, was designed by DeepMind and is a tool, or rather the tool, that solves protein folding, a problem that has been known and researched on for decades. AlphaFold is able to predict the 3D structure of a protein only based on its amino acid sequence. Before, this was a tedious, expensive, and time-consuming task. From the almost 200 million different proteins we know of, we only knew the 3D structure of a tiny fraction. Therefore, this is exciting news, since almost everything within our bodies and the world in general works thanks to proteins. The 3D structure of a protein is what determines its function, and therefore being able to accurately predict this structure is a huge step towards first understanding proteins, and secondly designing drugs and proteins according to custom needs. Drug discovery. This opens up a hell of a lot of possibilities. But it's not just protein folding, which is an interesting task, also the interaction of proteins. May it be with other proteins or different molecules. I am currently working at the Helmholtz Centrum for Infection Research in the Bioinformatics Lab, and I'm trying to build a deep neural network that predicts the binding free energy of a protein upon mutation, therefore trying to determine which mutation might cause harm, is benign, eases protein interaction, or inhibits it. This would also be important knowledge for drug design. Knowing which amino acids to mutate in order to inhibit a certain interaction without causing any harm would really lever modern medicine. Last summer, though, I spent my time there working on a different task using automated machine learning, which is what I'm going to introduce to you now. AutoML, automated machine learning. AutoML is a very interesting tool. It was designed by a team of machine learning specialists from Freiburg and Hanover with the goal of developing a tool that makes the use of ML accessible, even for people who do not have the background knowledge. This is because in loads of different fields, people have to deal with an increasing amount of data, and while more data often equals more information, one does need proper tools to deal with the data. Machine learning is, as we already learned, a powerful tool here. AutoML is built upon the scikit-learn machine learning library, which composes plenty different pre-processing, classification, clustering, and regression algorithms, some as introduced above. AutoML uses 15 of those different classifiers and 14 different pre-processing methods. Given the data, it automatically pre-processes the data, chooses the best algorithm, and optimizes its hyperparameters. All the user has to do then is analyze the results. It also makes very smart use of metadata and builds an ensemble to further improve accuracy. But now back to the paper. To round it all up, the author lists a couple of real-world applications in which machine learning algorithms are already used or could and should be used in the future. I know this is quite a bit of text, but this is only to stress how large of an impact machine learning already has on our lives and will have in the future. I do not know which one of these application fields I should draw most attention to, since they are all highly important, though healthcare might be, in times like these, the most current one. Another problem that still has not been solved is natural language processing, i.e. the actual understanding of written and spoken language. This is, as I think, another very fascinating topic. Using the right algorithm, one can perform opinion mining on the internet regarding a specific topic. I would ask you to remember this point until our discussion. I also want to stress the application of machine learning in agriculture to achieve a more sustainable approach and maybe, or hopefully, help fighting climate change. Lastly, the paper mentions some challenges we are facing and suggests some research directions. Current challenges are undeniably gathering complete and enough data, pre-processing of that data, and the selection of a suitable algorithm for the task at hand. As future research directions, the paper suggests to invest time into better cleaning and pre-processing method, as well as hybrid models or ensembles, or designing entirely new learning models. Their overall conclusion is that the biggest problem is choosing the right algorithm and properly cleaning the data. This leads us right into our critical evaluation of the paper. First things first, they did present a very neat overview of current important ML algorithms that gives the reader an idea of what exists and what could be used. They also gave a rather extensive list of application fields, which is nice as well. Some negative points to mention, though, are there was a lot of repetition in the paper, which made reading it a little unfluent. Also, their suggested research directions were not novel at all and rather vague. I am also still wondering why they did not include AutoML, which is basically a tool working on their exact suggested research directions. Thank you all for listening. I hope you enjoyed this, I know pretty long and hopefully not too dull, presentation on machine learning algorithms and their applications. I'm looking forward to our discussion on this topic. Here is another ML application, by the way, a meme generator. The link is provided below. Check it out, have fun. Bye!